All right, so describe Stalin's rise to power in USSR, the Soviet Union. Within your response, explain how Stalin tried to modernize, industrialize, westernize the Soviet Union. Also, detail how Stalin controlled the masses and what he did to eliminate political opposition. Oh boy, there you go. So, like we've been talking about with Mussolini, a lot of the same control will be seen with Stalin here, like we talked about, like we mentioned. And same thing with a lot of these other dictators. All right, so a lot of control, a lot of power, use of the media, right? Indoctrination, all is a common factor here with these dictators. Do we need another minute? Good. Okay. All right. So we talked about Mussolini. Again, what kind of dictator is he? What ideology again? Connor. Fascist. Yeah, good job. So extreme nationalists on the far right. Okay, the difference between fascism and communism is that there is private ownership, private property, private businesses within a fascist dictatorship, but it all glorifies the nation. On the other hand, though, far left is what? Paul, you said it, so I'll allow you to say it again. Communism, yes, good job, good. So, communist leader here, Joseph Stalin. All right, we'll talk about Russia at the end of World War I. Did they finish out the war? Oz? No, they left in 1917, right? Okay, why? What were they going through? Chris? Yes, they're going through a revolution. Good. Who led that revolution? What was his name? Connor. Vladimir Lenin. Yep, good job. We talked about how Germany kind of uses this as a secret weapon, right? To get Russia out of the war and end that two-front war. So yeah, Lenin goes back to Russia here, and he stirs up this revolution, this Bolshevik revolution, create the first communistic state. Overthrow Tsar Nicholas II. Remember Rasputin? Crazy voodoo magic man. All right. Anyway. So with Vladimir Lenin, he takes control within the Soviet Union. All right, but he doesn't last too long afterwards. He dies pretty quick, actually, in the 1920s. And this leaves an opening for a successor. And this is how Stalin's already kind of showing what kind of man he is. A man searching for power, eliminating anybody that might oppose him or his opposition. So Trotsky and Lenin, they're kind of going at it, make a short story out of it. Okay, they exile Trotsky, he gets killed, and Stalin is now the leader here, the premier, which means their leader. So if you guys see premier in the Soviet Union, that means they're totalitarian dictator, right? So just like Mussolini, what was his nickname again? Austin. Watch your language, yes. Duce, good. Which means the leader, Italian, good. All right, so with Stalin, the premier, okay, he has a lot on his plate, right? Is Russia industrialized? Not really, no. They're far, far behind when it comes to this industrialization, this modernization. Ever since we've been talking about Russia, ever since the age of absolutism, their whole goal is to try to achieve this modernization. Remember that window to the west, St. Petersburg? Yeah? Okay, good. So, yeah, ever since then, really, they're trying to keep up with the times. And they haven't been doing a great job. Why? Because it's Tsarist Russia. All right, so now Stalin is going to try to force industrialization into the Soviet Union. The only way to compete, the only way to survive in this environment. Oh, remember survival of the fittest? And social Darwinism? Okay, good. Okay, the only way to survive here is to force this modernization, force this industrialization. And what does he use to do that? What are these plans called? What are these plans called? Vocab from yesterday. Alana. 5-year plans. Yep, good job. So forcing this industrialization into the Soviet Union. It doesn't happen naturally, like you see in these other Western European countries. It takes a lot of time and at the cost of millions of people. Right? Towards the end of Stalin's dictatorship, 20 million people will die. Why? Because this forced industrialization, this forced labor, which we'll talk more about here. All right, so these 5-year plans, do you think it ends after 5 years? You think he just says, hey, after 5 years, these objectives are met, we're good to go. No, they continue on, okay, and continue until his death in the 1950s. But one thing to note, even though it cost billions of lives, literally, what did happen with the Soviet Union? It became the second largest industrial power. Behind whom? Well, United States, yep, good job. So after World War II, you'll have two superpowers, which if we get to it, great. We can talk about the Cold War. That's awesome, but we'll see, depending on how much time we have. So yeah, Soviet Union will rise to industrial power, a superpower after World War II. And a lot of that is because of Stalin. But again, it was at the cost of millions of people. Also, when it comes to answering the problem with food shortages, famine, what do you do? What do you do? Another term. These terms aren't too crazy. Paul, what's that? Okay, what was that term called though? I didn't grab them all. Another term. Possessing it for himself. The state. Parker. Collectivization. Yeah, good job. So with this collectivization program here, these initiatives, this is where the state is grabbing up all the private property, private land. Remember, in a communist system, is there private property? Is there private organizations, industries? No. Right? So the state grabs it all up, try to produce as much food as possible, which they do, right? They do a pretty good job at ending some of these issues with famine that you see at the start of World War I. But once World War II comes around, and once that kicks off, where's all that food going to? The front lines, right? So no longer the citizens of Spain. All right, okay, so how does Stalin hold on to power? Is it anything different than Mussolini? Not really, right? So a little bit different as he's kind of just targeting anybody that might oppose him. Mussolini does the same thing, right? Kicks out, exiles anybody that might oppose this communist party, beliefs, ideology. Okay, what were those prison camps, these labor camps that were created? A lot of times way out here in the Iberian Peninsula. This is a frozen wasteland. And a lot of times they exile the people out there. Why? There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere, nothing to eat. It's all frozen. Go ahead, Paul. Yeah, the gulags, right? So with these gulags, they were forced labor camps. Again, a lot of times, initiative for these 5-year plans to grow the Soviet Union into a strong industrial power. Yeah, so they can sent to the gulags. A secret police is created, like the KGB, to control the population. What else did he use to control the population? Use of media. What's that called? Forms of what? To corrupt, manipulate the minds. Go ahead. Propaganda. Yeah. All right. Also, when it comes to targeting schools, education, right? He wants to make sure he can indoctrinate the youth because that's the next generation leading forward and create these people that are conforming to his beliefs, his ideology. All right. So you can see Stalin, pretty brutal, right? Okay. Towards the end of his life, like I said, in the 1950s, they'll just estimate how many people, millions of people died under his leadership, which is about 20 million. Crazy to think about. It comes to a point, even the Soviet Union, after World War II, realized that this guy was terrible. Even though he created a superpower out of the Soviet Union, they go through a process called de-Stalinization, meaning to try to strip his name from key cities like Stalingrad, what he later called Volgograd, because of his harsh leadership. So was he favored? Yeah, but not really. So it was one of those things where it's kind of double-edged sword. Okay, all right. So Stalin, is there any questions here about him? What else? What other terms did we mention? Talk about collectivization, the 5-year plans, the gulags. I think we're good. All right, so now we're going to transition to another power, this time, okay, Lincoln way out in Asia here. Okay, we talked a little bit about them in World War I, not too much though. What country do you think that is? What country? They're an island. They are an island. Oz. Japan. Yes, good job. All right, so now we're going to shift to Japan, see what's going on there. And you can see how these countries are becoming aggressive, belligerent, right? Yeah, I know the Soviet Union will join the Allied powers, but at first, it doesn't look that way. And we'll talk about that here. But now, transitioning to Japan. So you got Imperial Japan, Emperor Hirohito, and Hideki Tojo. Nick, once you get your terms, head down to Mr. Rupp, okay? Got him. All right, sir, go ahead. All right, okay. So Japan, during that age of exploration, were they happy with a lot of these European countries expanding over to Asia? Were they happy? No, they actually shut off their trade, and they're one of the countries in Asia, really one of the only countries in Asia that could actually successfully push away these European influences. Okay, So for the longest time, ever since 1400, let's say to 1800, they shut their borders down. They closed themselves off from the rest of the world. Okay, as these European countries, which we mentioned, talked about, were exploring here into China and extracting resources, really taking over the lands for Christian faith, but also at the same time, they were really utilizing it as a means of, again, resources and raw materials, really killing off a lot of the populations because these encounters, these first involvements. But Japan, they could isolate themselves. Why? What are they? Chris? I just called it right out. Yes, an island. Okay, so they have the ability to shut themselves off. So for 400 years, that's exactly what they did. Okay, at the start of the year, you guys remember that activity I had you do where you kind of are seated depending on where you're located, depending on your role. What was that? What was that called? This idea of classes and this idea of hierarchy. What was that? Go ahead, Matt. Feudal system. Yeah, the feudal system. Good job. So Japan actually embraced this feudal system, very similar to what we saw in Europe. Okay, obviously it was a little different, but for the most part, they had this feudal system. Okay, so the longest time they're shut off. Okay, shut out from the rest of the world. Do you think they had the ability to grow as an industrial state then when this industrial revolution comes around? No. Why? Because they're closed off. All right, so guess who comes on over across the Pacific Ocean and forces Japan to open up their borders? They do so through a form of gunboat diplomacy. You guys will talk about this more in American history. They come over with these huge Navy ships and pretty much just say, open up, we're going to blow you apart. Who do you think? Big bad who, Chris? Yes, the United States, good job. His name's Matthew Perry, not the guy from Friends, not Chandler from Friends. Not to confuse. Anyway. So his name's Matthew Perry. Opens up Japan, its trade with the United States. Okay, so Japan sees these huge naval ships, and they're like, well, we better open up trade and influence the United States, or we'll get destroyed. So Japan does that, and the United States gets trade. They have access now to these Asian markets, another stepping stone, so to speak, as they're making their way across the Pacific Ocean, from island to island, right? The Philippines here eventually, and to Japan. Right, so they have access now to trade with Asia. What does Japan get in return, though? What does Japan get in return? What do you think they want? What forced them to open up trade? Pulp. Yeah, their industrialization, right? They see these huge ships, these huge naval ships, and they're like, well, we want that, right? We want this strength. We want this opportunity to grow as an industrial state. And that's what actually kicks off Japan to become this strong industrial economy, this strong military, this military power. Well, because we came over and opened up trade, and they accepted this industrial state, this industrial power. And Japan quickly becomes the strongest industrial power in Asia, right? One that we will actually fight here in World War II. So in many cases, you look at it and say, we created our own enemy, which kind of did, right? So in any case, Japan, ever since the mid-1800s, has been growing as an industrial power. I just wanted to give you a quick recap of what's going on here in Japan. So the mid-1800s up until now, the 1920s, right after World War I here, they're growing as an industrial power. We also talked about Japan in World War I. What side were they on? Boner. The Allied powers. Yes, good job. So did they gain anything after World War I? We mentioned this towards the end of World War I. This is causing them to maybe shift their alliances here. Did they gain anything really? Were they treated fairly, let's say, with the other Allied powers? Were they as equal as the other Allied powers? No, they really weren't. So that caused them to have a bad taste in their mouth, a sour taste in their mouth, to a point where they're not going to really try to negotiate or communicate with the Allied forces. So as they're not doing that, as they're isolating themselves, once again, you think they're going to have a lot of trade coming into Japan? No. So this causes a lot of economic hardships, to a point where Emperor Hirohito looks at the situation and says, well, we need to look to try to expand. Okay, we can't depend on trade anymore with the outside world, with the Allied powers. They kind of shunned us. They kicked us out of the negotiation, really. Okay, they weren't listening to our side of the Treaty of Versailles, really, and the League of Nations. So Japan says, forget it, we're going to be on our own. Okay, are the other Asian countries, okay, like China, okay, like French Indochina, which we have known as Vietnam, are they adapted? Are they industrialized? No, they're not. Japan is really the only industrial power in Asia. We already talked too, right before World War I, who they defeated in the war. Who they defeated in the war? Paul, Russia, good. So they are a strong force. All right, now that they don't have trade, what do they need to do? So they can't depend on trade, which is a way to have peace, right? But what do they need to do now? To gain these resources like coal, like iron, eventually fuel like oil, the power of this industrial state. Connor? Yes, good job. They need to imperialize, right? They need to expand. They need to look to take over lands, right, past their own island. But let's face it, an island, you're limited to what resources you have, right? So they look to expand. First place they go is the Korean Peninsula. So it's right next door, obviously. They jump over the Korean Peninsula, take it over pretty quick. Again, is China here? Is Manchuria here, guys? And the Korean Peninsula, are they industrialized? Can they fight back against Japan, really? No, not really. Okay, so Japan just takes over this Korean Peninsula pretty quick. They also move into Manchuria, which is here in this part of China, and even parts. Well, I know it's Russia, but Soviet Union, but not quite yet at this point. And they move into modern-day Mongolia. They expand all the way over to here in these parts of Eastern Asia. And what do they have now? Resources, raw materials, right? And guess what? Do they have to depend on the Allied powers for this trade? No. What is that doing? They're making that connection away. They are separating themselves from this alliance system that they once had with the Allied powers. Eventually, they'll move down here into China. They call it the Sino-Japanese Wars, right? And they brutally take over the eastern coast of China, accessing a lot of the harbors, accessing a lot of the resources, raw materials that China has. Do you think the Allied powers are happy with that? No, they're not. They see this as an advancement, as this imperial nation that's looking to maybe start warfare. But what's Japan's answer back to that? Do you think they view the Allied powers as hypocrites? Yeah. What was Great Britain doing in China just 300, 200 years beforehand? Not even 100 years beforehand. Expanding into China, right? They're doing the exact same thing, accessing these resources and raw materials, right? France, same thing. They're right here. It's literally called French Indochina. Why? Because France settled there, right here in Vietnam. So Japan's looking at the Allied powers and saying, why are you slapping us on the wrist? Why are you looking at us as the belligerents? Why are you looking at us as the problem? Right? We are the ones that are doing the exact same thing that you did. Why can't we go through this process of imperialization? Why can't we claim these resources and raw materials? Because we're stronger. We're more industrialized. We have a stronger military. And the Allied powers just look at it and say, well, we're past that point. There's no reason to do that. We can just have trade. Well, that's already too far gone for Japan. So Japan accepts this military dictatorship. Okay. So with this military dictatorship, they're embracing extreme nationalism. So where do you think they fall in the political spectrum? Extreme nationalism. Where do they fall? Where do they fall in the political spectrum? Far right. Yes, good job. So there's Emperor Hirohito. For the most part, he has no decision. He's the one who kind of appointed Hideki Tojo, who's this military general, and says, hey, take Japan, imperialize other nations, rise as a world power. So for the most part, it's all Hideki Tojo. And after the war, which we'll talk about, Hideki Tojo is punished to the point where he gets killed by hanging. And I'll show you a video. It's actually kind of fun. I know it's terrible to talk about hanging trials, but as he's getting trial, there's a person sitting behind him, and they're counting through his war crimes. Hideki Tojo is right here at the bottom right. And this guy behind him goes up and slaps him on the head. It's like, oh, how dare you? Slaps him right on the head. It's kind of funny. But in any case, you can see how Japan is imperializing nations, becoming a strong industrial power, and there's really no one to challenge them out in Asia. China can't do so. They're not industrialized. Right? You look down at the other southeastern Asian territories and lands, they can't challenge Japan because they're not industrialized. So with Hideki Tojo, he utilizes this military force, this military stand as this military dictator, and takes control. So yeah, Emperor Hirohito is kind of the one in charge, but for the most part, Hideki Tojo is Imperial Japan's control Southeast Asia, and creating another enemy for the Allied powers, the United States. So yeah, we're talking about Benito Mussolini in Italy, Stalin in the Soviet Union. Now Japan, things are just ramping up. Tensions are rising. And we didn't even get to Hitler yet. This is crazy. We talked about Hitler a little bit. So you can see after World War I, things are in shambles. There's chaos. There's anarchy. These countries are embracing imperialism, nationalism, militarism, all once again. And what does that show with the Allied powers, League of Nations? Are they strong? Can they stop these countries from doing so? No, they're very weak. Okay, is there any questions? Japan. Oh boy. Imperial Japan. All right, okay. So we'll talk with Japan. They brutally take over a lot of portions in China, causing a lot of tensions there, killing over millions of people, torturing them brutally. And it's kind of sad. Okay, we'll talk about the Bataan Death March. We'll talk about these terrible situations in China. All right, there you go.